So what I have in this box is a really interesting approach to budget dedicated astrophotography cameras that make it easy for beginners to get into the hobby with such dedicated cameras and the filters that they need for that, whether they go for a monochrome camera or a color camera. So let me explain. If you get into astrophotography, chances are you might start with something like a DSLR or a mirrorless camera paired with lenses or small telescopes. But down the road, it's likely that a lot of amateurs will want to go for a dedicated, cooled astrophotography camera, where the cooling aspect of the camera makes all the difference. Things become so much easier once your camera is cooled. And when you do so, you have the choice typically between going for a color camera, basically the same as cameras that you're used to, or a monochrome camera that you pair with filters so you're able to get the colors via red, green and blue filters and others as necessary. And in general, monochrome cameras are better because even for the same nominal resolution, number of pixels on the sensor, size of the pixels, etc., monochrome cameras end up getting you better resolution than color cameras. That's because they don't have to do an operation called debayering. And also for the same amount of time spent on a target, a monochrome camera will have gathered more signal-to-noise ratio than a color camera. Well, depending on how you do the imaging, but you can actually achieve that. Meaning that monochrome cameras are typically better in terms of image quality for the hobby, but also more cumbersome. They're more expensive, and you need to buy other stuff for them. You need to buy a filter wheel and you need to buy filters for it. So you'll need a luminance filter, a red filter, a green filter, a blue filter, and if you're in a light polluted area, you'll also want to go for some narrowband filters called sulfur 2, hydrogen alpha, and oxygen 3, which are amazing for emission nebulae like the Great Orion Nebula, the North American Nebula, the California Nebula, the Dumbbell Nebula, etc. And they can give us great results, but all of that costs a lot of money and you need to take care of all of that stuff. So there have been attempts in the hobby to make that easier. So you have some cameras by ZW, for instance, that have an integrated filter wheel and then you can place your filters in there, but it's still quite expensive. And here comes QHY, and QHY looks at the available cameras on the market and the available sensors on the market, and they're like, oh, there's this 585 sensor, which I love. I've shown on the channel quite a lot. And a monochrome version of that sensor has been released. So we have both a color version and a monochrome version of that sensor. That sensor has small pixels, which can give us really good pixel scale for small telescopes. And the sensor itself is tiny. What if I created a camera with an integrated filter wheel, but instead of using standard filter sizes, I would just size down the filters to just cover the sensor area, which is tiny, and then build a filter wheel in there. That way, I would get a camera that is cooled, astrophotography camera with one of my favorite sensors on the market, but also an integrated filter wheel with the filters provided, because the filters are tiny, they're cheap to make. So we're able to provide that at a really low price, relatively speaking. So enters the QHY Minicam 8, and this thing comes either naked, no filters provided, color, monochrome, and with the filters relevant for either version. This one is the monochrome version with its filters. So let's have a quick look at what's inside. Inside the box, we get a carry case, okay? We get some instructions with QR code to actually get more instructions. Always good to get a lot of instructions. And then we get the Minicam 8 in a plastic bag. So it looks like this. It looks like an old-timey CCD camera to me, with the cooler kind of like sprouting out of the camera. And you have a USB port for input, and you have a DC 12-volt port also for input. It will power the cooler of the camera. This is very standard. And then at the tip of the camera, we have this little tiny dust cap that is screwed in, and we can remove, and you can see that it is currently set up to the dark filter. It's a filter protection window, but inside we actually have a filter wheel that you can rotate through all of the filters. I'll show you in a moment because it's cute as pie. And right next to it, we get some candy. They're not candy. Those are the filters that we're going to use. Look at those things. They are tiny. Luminance, red, green, blue, sulfur 2, H alpha, oxygen 3. They're all there for our convenience, so you have the whole set in one go at a reasonable price, because the price of this camera, so the monochrome camera with all of the filters you need, and those filters are luminance red, green, blue, of course, and then the narrowband filters are all 7 nanometer band passes, which is decent. And the first thing I did, obviously, was test those filters with my spectrophotometer. They are all well-centered and according to specs. Maybe Oxygen 3 has a full width half-max of 7.5 nanometer, but okay, I'll grant them that. So with that, with those tiny filters, QHY can keep the camera tiny. There's a filter wheel in there, which is awesome, with 7 positions that are available, and it can keep it cheap. The monochrome with all of those filters is $800 US, $799, and sometimes it's on sale. Right now, as I'm filming this video, it's on sale for like something like $670 US. Probably won't be on sale by the time I release the video, sorry about that. Then the color version with the filters, which include 4 filters like UV IR cut, quad band filter, kind of light pollution filter, and then what they call a heavy light pollution filter, which I assume is a dual band filter. I'm not completely sure. That one costs $700 US, $699. And then the naked version, either monochrome or color, costs $599 US for a dedicated cooled astrophotography camera together with an integrated filter wheel. I think that's pretty cool. I've also noticed that the filters for the monochrome version, the one that I have, are made by QHY, which I have featured on the channel before, and I found they had a really good filter. And so I'm glad they're made by QHY because I have a lot of trust in them. And the color version filters are made by Optolong, in whom I have less confidence based on measurement of filters that were a bit all over the place, but they seem to have gotten much better recently. So I assume it's going to be fine. In the box, we also have some accessories. There is an M48 adapter to the camera that will give you exactly 55 millimeters of back focus. So you use it as is, which means that if you use this adapter, you won't be able to use an off-axis guider with most telescopes. Something to keep in mind. It also comes with a desiccant stick if you need to refresh the desiccant within the camera. It comes with a screwdriver to help install the filters. It comes with screws, I assume, to keep the filters in place once you install them. I haven't installed them yet. There's also an adapter for 125-inch, basically size, which I probably will not be using. And then we have tweezers to manipulate those tiny, cute little filters. How awesome is that? I love that QHY just thought of that and like, hey, we're going to build our own filters. Which also means, by the way, an obvious thing is you need to use this format of filters. This format of filters is not standard. It's only produced by QHY via their sourced providers, manufacturers. So if you want to progress later on and go for 3 nanometer bandpass filters, either you're out of luck or QHY makes them somehow later on. So that is obviously the main limitation of that. But at that price, this is awesome that they thought of those tiny filters to reduce the price. We also get the standard, power cable, the power brick, and then we also have the power cable, which is threaded at the end. So on the side of the camera, you actually have a threaded input for the power, which actually makes it impossible, to get the cables off during the night, which is a good point, unless you have a runaway mount, and then it could potentially rip that whole port out. So yeah, depending on your point of view. And then we have a USB 3 cable for controlling the camera. As usual, or as what I've seen for QHY cameras, we do not get an integrated USB hub for the camera. So I don't get my usual 2 USB ports that I love to use to connect to an electronic focuser and also an off-axis guider or my guide scope. So that's a bit annoying. It would have been very, very nice to have that, but it is a quality of life feature rather than something that is an absolute must. So let's have a look inside the camera to see what kind of filters we get. So I'm going to use the provided screwdriver to remove those 4 screws at the front, and it's done there. They seem to be all of the same length, which is good. No need to remember which is which, and we can completely open the camera body and have a look inside, and we can see all of those tiny filters can be placed within the camera body. And the system seems to be actually quite interesting. You have those additional screws here that are basically, I think, used to remove one layer of the filter wheel. Then you put the filters inside, and then you put back this layer and tighten the screws again. So it seems to be fairly straightforward. And by the way, when you turn on the camera and you connect it to the computer, the camera will always go back to position number 1. We have the positions well numbered on the camera itself. So I'll definitely keep the dark filter in number 1 because it also acts as a dust cap on the camera itself, which is nice to protect the sensor as much as possible. And indeed, after removing those 8 screws, we have this layer on top that is available. We can put the filters in and then put back that layer and we're good. And we can see the dark filter is indeed just hanging on by gravity on number 1 until I place back this layer again. So the screws I saw earlier are simply replacement screws, I believe, for those in case you lose some screws. So it's nice to have some backups there. And I don't want to angle it too much or to speak too much into it to avoid putting some spit onto the filters, but there they are. They are only holding on by gravity. And now what I'll do is I'll just put this on top to hold them in place. And here we are with the filters installed. They're never gonna fall. It's all good now. And so I've put in position number 1, as I said, the dark filter. And then 2 will be luminance, red, green, blue, sulfur 2, H alpha, oxygen 3. So it's all good. It's going to be a lot of fun. I've noticed in my tests, by the way, that I could not set the filter wheel direction, at least in Nina. And so it's always going in in that direction to go through to the filter. So if you want to go from dark to L, it's only 1 step. But if you want to go from dark to oxygen 3, it's going to go through the whole path until oxygen 3 is on top. So now I can go ahead and simply close off the camera with its cover using the 4 screws that we had at the very beginning. By the way, the provided screwdriver is magnetic at the tip. It made it very easy to install the filters and then the filter cover. And here we are. It's all ready with all of the filters inside. I can simply put in the M48 adapter, which, as I can tell, also doubles as a 2-inch, like if you want to insert it into a 2-inch tube, it seems to work as well. Which could be good actually for planetary imaging, that kind of stuff. And same thing, the small adapter is 1.25 inch, so you can just input it into the 1.25 inch tube, like a diagonal, or at prime focus of a Schmidt-Cassegrain, and then you can do planetary with that. That's a scenario I hadn't thought of, but it's cool to be able to go from LRGB for planetary to quickly capture with as much details as possible. Maybe not the prime scenario for this camera, I'll be using it for deep space astrophotography, but it is a valid scenario. And I will be putting it on my Askar SQA55, which I've reviewed on the channel before, and that is an amazing little telescope. So here we go. I'll just, connect it. It works just as is. I love this. This is in place. This is so cool. So I've already taken some measurements of this camera, just the sensor, using the Sharpcap sensor analysis, just to see, the read noise, that kind of stuff. And one thing I have noticed that was a drawback to me is that the fan there spins immediately at full speed the moment you connect power to the camera. And as far as I can tell, I couldn't find a way to turn off the fan. And when I was inside, it was a bit irritating because you know how it is to have like the small fan of a laptop be at full speed. It's kind of a similar feeling. So inside it was not pleasant. When you're outside, it doesn't matter at all. But that's something I noted, so I wanted to quickly mention it. And I'll show you when connected to Nina how we can use this camera. And I'll take some images, maybe of, I don't know, in this season it might be Orion, it might be the Horsehead Nebula, just to show you how well this QHY works. So let's go inside, look at the Nina setup, look at some results, look at some sensor analysis results, all that kind of good stuff. A lot of work for that review, as always. And as always, my Patreon supporters, my channel members, you make it possible by sponsoring this channel. So if you're watching and you want to support the channel, the easiest way is to click that like button. It really helps. You can also leave a comment down below. That also helps a lot. And let me know what you think of this. This is a cutie pie of this little system. Sure, you won't be able to replace the filters easily, but at that price, it's such a cool entry to astrophotography. for both monochrome and color cameras. I love this concept. But yeah, let me know what you think of that in the comments. If you want to support me even more at no cost to you and you're planning on buying anything from Agena, High Point Scientific, First Light Optics, or even Amazon, including this little camera, if you do so after clicking the links that I have down in the description, it will help me out at no cost to you. And if you want to sponsor the channel and make all of my work possible, you can become a channel member. This is the join button next to the subscribe button, or a Patreon supporter using the link that I have down in the description. Thank you so much to my channel members and Patreon supporters for making this possible. Anyway, let's go inside and have a look at some setup and results. Okay, and so I'm on the specs page for the Minicam 8. You can see all of the pricings I've discussed already, with the monochrome color naked version, the combo for the color version, and the combo for the monochrome version. And today we are testing the combo for the monochrome version, where the filters are made by Shimei. And if we look at the filter bandpass themselves, as I mentioned, I already measured my filters, and those bandpasses are correct. So we have oxygen 3, we have H-alpha in purple, we have sulfur 2 in blue here, and then we have like red, green, and blue. And indeed, I've checked with my spectrophotometer, they are exactly as per specs, which is excellent. We'll also see that the filters are extremely parfocal, meaning that your focus point doesn't really change when you change filters, which can absolutely happen even with filters that are nominally parfocal. So in terms of the specification, we're using the AMX585 sensor. We have those 2.9 micron pixels that I really love. And one of the things that I love with this sensor is the quantum efficiency. You can see it's extremely high for oxygen 3, for H-alpha, and for sulfur 2. And that's one of the things with the 585 sensor that is really superior to the 571 sensor and its variants, like the 533 or the ASI 2600. I don't remember the name of that sensor, but you can see that the quantum efficiency at around H-alpha drops to only 60%. And when we go to sulfur 2, it's right above 50%. The 585 sensor, while being much smaller, has much better quantum efficiency for our bandpasses of interest, which is really nice. Plus, it has near-infrared capabilities that are superior to the 571 type sensors, although with these filters, we won't take advantage of it. Now, in terms of how they've set it up, if you remember, like the 585 sensor, different manufacturers have implemented it differently. My favorite implementation is from TubeTech, because you can choose low conversion gain, high conversion gain explicitly, instead of having a switch depending on your gain setting, at which you suddenly go from low conversion gain to high conversion gain. The advantage of high conversion gain is that you get much lower read noise at the cost of a slight bit of dynamic range. But those are the specs, and we can see that the switch that QHY chose for this camera sensor is fairly early in the gain range, which is a bit better than what ZW has chosen for their own camera, where it's a bit later in the gain range. I also did the Sharpcap sensor analysis, and we get sensibly the same result. That cutoff point is at gain 80 when you're not using the linearity HDR mode, which I have not tested yet. And if you're very confused about what all of those curves do, I have a full explanation about that. I'll put the link up above and down in the video description. It's really important to understand these things. It makes things a lot clearer. But basically, what you want is the highest possible dynamic range here for the lowest possible readout noise. The other two graphs are basically inputs to what gives us the dynamic range as an output. I mean, even the read noise is, but whatever. So basically it tells you that in most circumstances, you'd probably want to image with the gain here, where you have the lowest read noise, while having the highest dynamic range, and that is at gain 80. Here, by the way, I have the results of the Sharpcap sensor analysis, and we can see something that is very close to what they advertise, to what QHY advertises. I'm not sure why the dynamic range at the top is stuck to 12 stops. It should be a bit higher. It's very weird to have a dynamic range that is flat at the very start. But we can see that at gain 80, suddenly our read noise goes from 3.79 to 1.05, and the dynamic range goes back up to 11.62. So for me, Personally, I will pretty much always be using this camera at gain 80, even when using like luminance, red, green, and blue filters, because I'm fine with 11.6 stops of dynamic range. But overall, we can see that this agrees with the charts published by QHY. Note that it says the sensor is linear to 82.5%. When it was displaying the sensor curve, I was seeing this change in linearity for the very highest gains around here, which we would never use in real life, so I'm not really worried about that at all. In terms of field of view that is covered by this camera, it has a small sensor, right? So with a small refractor like the one that I've installed it, if I wanted to take an image of M31, you can see here that we do not cover the entirety of the Andromeda galaxy. On the other hand, if I go to M1, the Crab Nebula, then it is actually a pretty good fit. We would get decent details on M1, the Crab Nebula. So it really depends on the telescope that you will be using. If you're using one of those very classic 90 millimeter triplets, you'd get a much closer view on something like M1, but obviously on M31 you'd be even less field of view. If you're using a Newtonian, let's say a Newtonian with 8-inch Newtonian with a focal length of 780 millimeters, you'd be even closer in. So you can get really very much of a vibe that this sensor can and is a galaxy killer and a planetary nebula killer. But if you want the wider field of view for larger objects, then you'll really want to go for small refractors like the ASCAR SQF55. Okay, and how does it work in Nina? Well, in Nina, you can simply connect the camera, connect the filter wheel, and for me, they appear basically as native choices. So if I disconnect the camera, you can see QHY CCD is there. The Toptech one is my guide camera, and I'm just going to connect it. And then the filter wheel is exactly the same. I can check that it's available as a native filter wheel. This is after installing the drivers provided by QHY. And one thing that is very interesting with the camera, and I've already alluded to that, and it is a negative point of the camera, the moment you connect it to both USB and power, actually even just power, it cools the camera sensor full blast. So you can see sensor temperature is minus 16 degrees Celsius, but I have not asked it to cool the sensor. It just goes full blast immediately, which is an interesting strategy. Like when I tell it to cool to minus 10 degrees, the cooler power will actually need to be reduced. Even though with the current drivers, the cooler power is like always at 0%. I'm not exactly sure what's going on with that. But then I'm using kind of beta drivers at this stage. So I'm sure this is something that QHY can fix later on. In terms of the filters, exactly as I have set them up, you can see I have the dark filter in the first slot and then LRGBSHO. Currently it is on the dark filter, but I can change easily by, choosing a filter and then switching the filter, and it works out. No problem at all. And you can go to sulfur and it will switch to sulfur. It works very well, and the way that it works, it uses optical indexing of the filters. On the filter wheel itself, on the sides, there are tiny holes, and those holes are being checked via a light-sensitive diode plus an infrared LED that are within the camera body. There is one of the filters that has two tiny holes next to it, and when you place your filters and place back the filter cover, you need to make sure that the filter slot with those two tiny holes is aligned with the cover area that also has two tiny holes. Otherwise, the indexing will stop working. So if you ever use this camera, place the filters, and after placing the filters, the filter wheel no longer works. That's because of that. You need to make sure that all of the holes are aligned to one another. One of the things I also wanted to check was how parfocal the filters were, meaning how much they affect the actual focus point as you change filters. And the ASCAR SQF55, because it has such basically perfect color focusing, it focuses all of the colors effectively at the same spot on the focal plane, it's a perfect telescope to check that. And so I used the plugin that would basically run an autofocus run for each filter, one after the other, and then it did that 3 times and then took the average. And then we just wrote down the average of the focus position for each of the filters. And this is the results that we got in terms of the focus position. And I found this to be excellent, because you can see my autofocus step size was 40 steps. So that means a very small change in focus. And I set my overshoot backlash as usual to basically 10 times the autofocus step size. And you can see that the filter with the lowest position is at 28,374. The filter with the highest focus position in terms of focuser index is at 28,405. So there's only a difference of 31 steps, 31 focuser steps between those filters that are like the maximum possible filter focus shift that we have. And if I show you some focus runs for last night, you can see that between 2 points, you only have 40 steps. So imagine that the filter that has the lowest focus index position when it is in focus was in focus at this point on the curve. That means that the filter that is furthest away from that first filter in terms of focus position would be around here. So you can see there's basically no focus shift between the filters. That is excellent. And I'm not the only one to have noticed that. Luke from the Lucomatico channel also noticed the same in his review. So that means that you almost don't need to set up filter offsets. You can focus with the luminance filter because it's the fastest to focus. You don't need like very long exposures for it. And then switch over to sulfur 2 H-alpha oxygen 3 without redoing autofocus between filters. And for me, because I'm in Nina, I've set my focus offsets, meaning that Nina will shift the focus point very slightly when I change filters automatically. And you can see I've also set the L filter as the autofocus filter. So even if I'm doing like SHO imaging, when the time comes to do autofocus, I will go to the luminance filter, do autofocus there, and then go back to SHO filters. And I've already tested that, it works beautifully. By the way, this autofocus filter setting in Nina, I made that. I added that to Nina back in like 2020. And it is made exactly so that you can save time instead of having like 5-second exposures, or if you were using very slow telescopes like a Schmidt-Cassegrain, you'd have like 10 seconds in there, and then instead of spending all of that time autofocusing, you can save time by having this autofocus filter. So for tonight, let's say I want to take images of the Horsehead Nebula. How would I go about setting that up? So I can simply, add the target to the sequence, and I don't have any templates on this, so I'm just going to use basic sequence target to show you, and just so that we don't have Nina kind of freaking out about like, hey, I cannot guide, I cannot move the mount, I cannot focus, I cannot do anything. I'm going to connect everything, and let's go back to the sequencer. So there's the slew, center, and rotate. I don't have a rotator, so I'm just going to replace that with slew and center. Should work either way, but doesn't hurt. Then we run the autofocus, then we start guiding, and then we have the triggers. We have the meridian flip trigger to do the meridian flip when needed, and then we can keep the autofocus after HFR increase, another feature that I originally added to Nina, and I remove autofocus after filter change because I don't need that. I have my filter offsets, and I don't even need my filter offsets because we've seen how the filters are almost perfectly parfocal. That said, if you have a telescope where you have some chromatic aberration, typical with doublet refractors, then you will still need your focus, your filter offsets. Because even if the filters are parfocal, your telescope is not parfocal between the different wavelengths. For me, I can remove it because I'm using the SQF55. And then I would want to take images, and what I can do is simply switch to filter, let's say, S for sulfur 2 first, and take an exposure. And then because I will not be refocusing between filters, I can loop between the filters and go H, and then O for oxygen 3, and then take an exposure after each. And the exposure will be 300 seconds long, so 5 minutes for each. And instead of looping for 20 iterations, I can loop until the altitude is below 30 degrees. And here we go. So that would be basically, and I removed this smart exposure from the default one, but you can see that is basically my way of imaging with those filters. I switch the filter, take a 300-second exposure, switch the filter, take a 300-second exposure, switch the filter, take a 300-second exposure, and I can do that because those filters are so parfocal. And even if they weren't, or I'm using a telescope where you need to refocus between filters, I can measure, and I have measured my filter offsets, and Nina can take that into account automatically. And that way I'm sure that at the end of the night, even if clouds rolled in, I have exposures for every single of my filters. But you can see how all of this can work together and how a camera for $800 can give you everything you need to do monochrome imaging, because you can pair it with freeware, even open source free software, Nina, and it all just works. Anyway, let's have a look at the end result. Okay, so now that I have a night of imaging with this camera, I want to show you the result. It was indeed on the Horsehead Nebula, and you've probably guessed the actual reason why I did that. It is because there is the very bright star Alnitak in there, so we can see if any of the filters have halos. And so we can answer this question. This is basically each image was 27 5-minute exposures in H-alpha, sulfur 2 and oxygen 3. I haven't tried in the end the LRGB filters yet, but those are typically not prone to halos, so I'm not very worried about them. But this is SHO, and you can see that sulfur on Alnitak seems to be okay. H-alpha on Alnitak seems to be fine, but oxygen 3 on Alnitak does have a halo. Again, this is kind of like the worst case scenario you can imagine for such a filter, but we do see a halo. So if you are a complete halo hater, this might not be for you. But still, it's like on a secondary kind of bright stars, I can see the outskirts of a halo. But for like 27 times 5 minutes exposure time, this isn't bad. I mean, if you know me, you know that I don't really care about halos. I don't mind them at all. If anything, they're proof that I use my own optics to take this image. It's like the imperfection that makes the image perfect. But yeah, I know a lot of people absolutely hate halos, and you do get them with oxygen 3. But overall, this is pretty cool, especially thinking that this whole thing, including the whole filter set, $800, the telescope, $800. So like the whole imaging train was $1,600. And if you're going to use monochrome cameras, you can probably get away with much cheaper telescopes as well. So yeah, I mean, this is a pretty compelling offering. So in terms of processing, I did the usual stuff. I basically followed my own PixInsight process, which I've documented in my Ultimate PixInsight guide, which is also on YouTube. I'll put the link up above and down in the description. And that was basically for each of the images, removing the background, doing blur exterminator, resampling the image down because I had drizzled it, then some noise exterminator, and then stretching the image, doing that for each of the filters. And once that was done, doing some LRGB combination to get this, followed by putting rotation so that we have a more familiar Horsehead angle. It's weird because it makes a difference in my processing, the orientation of the image. It shouldn't, but it does. It's really weird. Anyway, I set the right orientation again, removed the stars and the star image itself. I then inverted it, run SCNR on it, and then invert it again to remove the magenta from the stars. Then what do we have? Narrowband normalization. And then, we had some magenta stuff. So again, invert, SCNR, invert again to remove the magenta stuff. And then it's like masking and colors and curves. And there we go. That's basically the end result. And then it was just placing back the stars. And this is what we get with the stars placed back from my Tokyo rooftop balcony. That's I'm kind of like now I'm kind of wanting to get back to monochrome imaging because this is pretty neat, especially if you're using something like Nina, when you can just like go through the filters one after another, so you know that you have data for every single one of your filters. But this is, I'm like patting myself on the shoulder there again, but I like this image. I'm kind of happy with it. I don't know. Let me know down in the comments what you think of it. Leave a like while you're at it, by the way. It really helps the channel out. And if you want to help me even more, you know, affiliate links, Patreon, channel member, etc. But so this camera, good points. The filters are good. The band passes are well placed. Checked with the spectrometer, it's okay. There's a bit of a halo on Oxygen 3, but it's only on Alnitak, so it's really the worst case scenario. So that's good. Filter wheel, it just works. Just be careful when you install the filters to put back the filter holder disc in the right orientation so you don't block any of the holes that serves as index to the filter wheel. The camera itself, the sensor is the MX585 sensor, which you know I love. And you can use it in high conversion gain mode, which is what I did by setting it to gain 80. By the way, just for reference, my offset was 7, which seemed to be the right offset for my camera. That worked well. I have not tried this like linear HDR thing yet, but I will at some point, I'm sure. In terms of advantages as well, it is small and relatively light. I'm like looking at this, you would not think there's a whole filter wheel inside this camera body. And we can go to the stuff that I don't like or I would like to see improved. One is the lack of a USB hub. I find having 2 additional USB ports somewhere on the camera a huge advantage. But there's not a lot of space on this camera to actually do that, so I'm kind of okay with that. I'd also want to be able to have finer control on the cooler. It seems that, at least for me, when I plug in the camera and the USB, it just like starts cooling immediately. Although, like QHY tells me, they're not able to reproduce that exactly, so I'm waiting for them to double check on that. It might be my sample, but I suspect a firmware update can take care of that. And what else do I not like? Well, obviously the filters are a proprietary size. So if you want to go for 3 nanometer filters, 4 nanometer filters for SHO, for instance, tough luck. That's it, right? Tough luck. You have to make do with what you get. And another thing I'd like to see actually is an M48 adapter, or M42 or M54, I don't really care, but an adapter that gives me the exact back focus needed so I can add a 16.5 millimeter thick off-axis guider and get to 55 millimeters. Or it could be even the shortest possible M48 adapter, and then I make do with my own spacers, because this is actually a great camera for an off-axis guider because those filters inside are so parfocal. So by changing the filter, you never change, you know, the focus point for the off-axis guider. So the off-axis guider is always perfectly in focus, or very close to perfectly in focus, which is exactly what we want. And, you know, I think also, this came to mind for version 2 QHY, if you're listening, would be to find a way to add like a guiding chip within the camera that is not behind the filter wheel, so you can have all of the advantages of something like the ZWO ASI 2600 MC Duo without the drawbacks of it having to image through the filters. That would be pretty cool. But yeah, otherwise, at this price, $799, you can get into monochrome imaging. And at this time, especially like with the end of year sale, unfortunately, when I publish this video, it's probably no longer going to be the end of year sale, except maybe for some tiers of my Patreon supporters who get access to my videos early and without ads. It is convincing, and I'm going to keep using it. It's fun. I didn't think monochrome would be fun for me again, but this camera is making monochrome fun for me again, because it's just like that. It works. And it uses one of my favorite sensors, super sensitive to H-alpha sulfur 2, also oxygen 3. It's good. It's very good. Obviously, other drawback, it's a filter wheel inside. So if the filter wheel fails, the whole camera is garbage. That's the problem with like fully integrated solutions. But otherwise, QHY stamp of approval overall, despite the shortcomings that I've mentioned. Let me know what you think in the comments. Would you be interested in such a camera? Are you, like me, a one-shot color camera user, and you're interested in going to monochrome, or for me, back to monochrome? Would love to see your opinions there. I love my comment section, by the way. There are so many good learning experiences in there. I learn stuff when I read the comments. Love everything there. And you can like the video. You can use my affiliate links if you purchase anything, including this camera, from various Astro stores or from Amazon. It really helps the channel out. And if you want to sponsor the channel directly, you can become a channel member, Patreon supporter, and I'll have the credits for those who make this channel possible at the end of this video, together with my image of the Horsehead Nebula, kind of going zoom in more and more so that you can see the details. Again, taken from Tokyo. I love this. With that, guys, I hope this was an interesting review for you guys. It is definitely a very interesting product. I really like the concept. But more important than all of that, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget whenever you can to look up at the stars, and I'll see you next time.